1984, director John Milius gave us Red Dawn. Milius previously directed Conan the Barbarian, of course. Now, Red Dawn is kind of a war movie, obviously, that was taking place during the kind of the Cold War and was very much of its time. And then in later years, it kind of was accused of aging badly. However, in 2022, with obviously the situation going on in Ukraine, I couldn't help but really think about this movie and kind of draw certain parallels to it compared to kind of what's actually kind of going on in the real world. Now, it was remade in 2012 that starred Chris Hemsworth, a movie that I have reviewed on the channel, but I've never actually reviewed the original film. So I watched this movie a long time ago when I was a kid, really, and I've just now rewatched it for this review, so let's discuss. So, as I say, directed by John Milius, and has an awesome cast. Heading up the cast, of course, is Patrick Swayze, but you've also got C. Thomas Howell, Leah Thompson, Charlie Sheen, Jennifer Grey, Powers Booth, Harry Dean Stanton, Ron O'Neill, William Smith, to name but a few there. Now, this movie was notable for a number of reasons. For example, it was the on-screen feature-length debut of Charlie Sheen, and at its time, it held the position in the Guinness Book of Records for the most amount of violent acts in a movie. So this was literally considered the most violent movie up until that point in 1984. Now, I don't know if it's surpassed that now. I'm assuming there's probably been more violent films, but at the time, this had the most amount of violent acts in any one film and was quite controversial because of it. Now, this movie is also notable for it not having any type of kind of miniatures, matte paintings, anything like that. Everything you see that happens in this movie was done full scale and actually kind of was all in camera. So it's quite impressive considering the amount of explosions and military kind of vehicles and things that you're going to see in this movie. But what is the story? So, and as I've said, this kind of draws parallels a little bit to what's happening in 2022, which is kind of why I felt kind of compelled to watch it again. So we have an invasion of America by the Soviet Union. Obviously, it was the Soviet Union back then rather than kind of Russia. And it's actually Cuban forces that kind of take the antagonistic force in this particular kind of area within the kind of the America. And we have a group of essentially school kids that are kind of managed to kind of escape the initial kind of attack and hide out in the woods. And through kind of trial and error, they kind of are able to try to strike back at the invaders through kind of guerrilla tactics and, you know, obviously using their guile and cunning and really kind of revenge to kind of get a upper hand on the much more superior force of the kind of this Soviet army. So that's kind of your story there in the basic strokes of it. Now, this was actually set somewhat in the future, so you can consider it somewhat of a sci-fi film, and this actually takes place in kind of World War III. This is the beginning of World War III in this movie. I think it's set in 1989, but obviously was, as I say, released in 1984. So, you know, now you might be saying, why didn't they use nukes? There is explained in the movie. There's kind of a thing about how the Green Party are in power. They don't want to kind of use nukes because they kind of want to, you know, basically keep America whole, and America doesn't want to fire nukes in their own country. So there is kind of an explanation about why there is not kind of nukes used in the movie. Okay, let's talk about what I think works in this movie. For a start, what a cast. I mean, a lot of these people were early in their career before they kind of hit kind of the big time, so to speak. But you have a slew of recognisable faces here. Now, Patrick Swayze, I suppose, is our central kind of protagonist, but there's not one sort of character that I would say completely kind of dominates everyone else. It's a big cast and very much feels like an ensemble piece rather than kind of like one kind of person leading the way. Albeit, as I say, you know, Patrick Swayze's character Jed certainly is the kind of you know, our kind of main sort of character, so to speak. It is truly impressive the amount of extras, military kind of vehicles that you have in this movie. It truly feels like a war movie at scale. You know, tanks, helicopter battles, it's kind of jets, lots of kind of like extras on the kind of the ground, you know, fortified towns, things like this. It's a truly impressive production considering the amount of hardware and, as I say, practical kind of explosions kind of on display here. Now, like I said, this came out in the kind of the mid-80s, and it certainly does have a degree of patriotism, certainly obviously from its home country of America. Now, we're going to touch upon this again, but it certainly does make you feel like, you know, if you were certainly a country that was invaded, and this is certainly a somewhat of a patriotic movie in regards to kind of rising against your oppressors and trying to take in these kind of small victories. But it's not kind of without the loss. Obviously, our kind of team of protagonists do take losses, and we actually do get a little bit of character kind of moments from the Soviet kind of forces as well, and we do get a kind of a small character arc, certainly with one of their kind of colonels. But there are a few little character moments here and there of kind of just like, you know, soldiers and things like that. There's some, I mean, the action starts literally within the first 5 minutes of the movie. And there are a couple of comedic moments in there as well, where we get one scene, for example, they run out of, they need to kind of put water in the radiator of their car, so they have to pee in it and things like this. And there's also some kind of quite scenes that stay with you. The first kind of scene that we see in the movie really is these Cuban kind of paratroopers kind of parachuting down into this school, and all the kids looking out the window, and then they kind of open fire at the there's one kid hanging out the window with a bullet hole in his head. And it's just, some of the imagery here, I would say, is certainly kind of quite kind of powerful. And as the film goes on, it doesn't let up. It is kind of action sequence after action kind of sequence. And I do like our characters as well. I mean, we get individual kind of character arcs through the movie. C. Thomas Howell, for example, is you know, he's just a kind of 15-year-old kid who kind of doesn't really know up from down at this point. But, you know, we see his kind of descent to being quite homicidal, to be honest with you, and kind of quite kind of bloodthirsty. So I do think, despite this, it's kind of having lots of kind of characters within the movie, I do feel it kind of juggles them kind of quite well, and I kind of, you know, quite like that. And you know, we see these guys evolve through the movie. Their first kind of like combat encounter is kind of relatively awkward, and they ultimately kind of luck into a kind of a victory. And then as the movie progresses, we see their kind of tactics kind of getting better and better and better as sort of the film progresses. So it makes it somewhat kind of a believable journey to a certain degree. I mean, there are some things that are unbelievable, but you know, in the world of this movie, you can understand their progression to becoming kind of more experienced kind of guerrilla fighters. And even though this movie was criticised for kind of being out of touch kind of after the 80s, it's strangely kind of looped round again, and we see these kind of like these sort of guerrilla tactics from civilians in Ukraine. And it's kind of, I don't know, I can't help but think of the parallels in there and things like this. It's kind of funny how these kind of things sort of turn around. And it's an entertaining movie. It might not be high art, this movie, let's be honest with you. It's certainly, you know, an action film kind of first, and you know, a thought piece second. But it is an entertaining movie that has non-stop, lots of kind of small roles for kind of you know, bigger actors and more established names, as like Harry Dean Stanton, Lane Smith, things like that. And it's, you know, it's one to enjoy. What doesn't work? So a number of things in this movie. Now, it certainly has a political agenda, this movie, and it is criticised for being somewhat kind of from a Republican point of view. Now, that's obviously only a criticism if depending on your particular kind of circumstance. And as I say, some people accuse this being out of touch. I actually think now it kind of seems strangely relevant again in a kind of a weird way. But it's certainly, and this kind of goes in what I say with this kind of the patriotic side thing, it is a little bit kind of like unbelievable in the fact that we do have a group of, I think, 8 going up to 9 kind of rebels, basically, kind of college kids and 1 soldier. managing to take on experienced kind of Soviet kind of soldiers and have such massive losses on their side. So it does become a little bit kind of maybe overly patriotic, you might say, and certainly a little bit kind of unbelievable in regards to how effective these kind of guys are realistic on a kind of realistic level. So you can't really watch this film realistically and kind of think, yes, this is a realistic portrayal of kind of guerrilla warfare and stuff, because it's obviously an entertainment kind of piece first and foremost. Because it's such a large ensemble, I do feel some of the characters aren't particularly kind of focused on. Certainly kind of like the female characters of the group, these Jennifer Grey and Leah Thompson, we don't really know much. You don't hardly get anything. They barely have any kind of lines, to be honest with you. Apparently there were some scenes that were cut that kind of involved a lot of their kind of like their the characters, but as the movie stands at the moment, there's certain characters here that don't really have a lot to do. There's a couple of clunkers in regards to some of the acting, I would have to say. There's a character called I think Daryl, who is the son of the local mayor, and I have to say he stands out to me as certainly the kind of the weakest actor from our group of protagonists. But he doesn't have a huge amount of screen time, as really no one does outside of kind of Patrick Swayze. Even Charlie Sheen here, I have to say, his acting isn't the best. But like I said, this was his first kind of feature-length kind of role here. And it ultimately becomes maybe a little bit kind of silly, maybe a little bit kind of thoughtless at times, potentially. But I gotta say, it's faults aside, and obviously if you're of a certain political ideology, you may like this better than others, but I still gotta say I enjoyed the hell out of this movie. This movie may not be a realistic depiction of war, but it's certainly a fun movie if you like a kind of balls to the wall action movie. I actually got to say, I think the action sequences were very well shot and quite exciting, and I kind of quite enjoyed the kind of premise. And watching it now, it's scarily, similar to what is happening in the real world in Ukraine and stuff. And I couldn't help but having thought of this movie whilst, obviously with everything that's kind of going on. So, it's a little scary in some ways, considering the precipice that the world is currently on with Russia and what's kind of going on there. But as a film as a whole, I've got to say, I personally feel this is a fun watch. It may not be perfect, it may not be high art, but I've got to say it's entertaining. It has some fantastically kind of shot action sequences with some impressive production value and a fun and likeable cast for the most part. So for me, it's a 7 out of 10. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.